Jim Morrison. The Lizard King. He was the leather-clad poet who seduced a whole generation with a hypnotic voice and a rebellious soul. To millions, he was a rock god, a shaman channeling the chaotic energy of the 60s. His image is carved right into the Mount Rushmore of rock and roll royalty, brooding, beautiful, and ultimately, doomed. He's remembered as one of the most captivating frontmen in music history, a guy whose influence has lasted for decades, even though his time in the spotlight was tragically short, but that's only half the story. While adoring fans saw a mystical prophet, many of his peers in the music world saw something else entirely. They saw an intense, unpredictable, and often combative drunk who was a nightmare to be around. To some of the biggest names in music, the artists who shared the stage and the scene with him, he wasn't some genius to be admired, he was a menace to be avoided. From a violent run-in with a fellow rock queen to being publicly called out by rock's most respected innovators, the story of Jim Morrison is also a story of epic feuds and monumental clashes of ego. Today, we're pulling back the curtain on the rockstars who hated Jim Morrison, revealing just how divisive the Lizard King really was. In the world of 1960s rock royalty, Janis Joplin and Jim Morrison sat on thrones at opposite ends of a very wild kingdom. She was the queen of psychedelic soul, a raw, blues-drenched powerhouse from Texas whose voice could shatter glass and break your heart. He was LA's dark prince of psychedelic rock, a poet whose baritone promised both intellectual freedom and primal danger. On paper, they looked like two sides of the same rebellious coin, both members of the tragic 27 Club, both defined by an electrifying, untamed stage presence. At first, there was even a bit of mutual admiration. Joplin was supposedly captivated by Morrison's talent, and Morrison was fascinated by her unstoppable energy. But a storybook ending was definitely not in the cards. Their feud is cemented in one legendary, violent incident that has become a cornerstone of rock and roll folklore. The setting was a party at the home of Paul Rothchild, the legendary producer who worked with both the Doors and Joplin's band. Rothchild apparently hoped the two titanic personalities might find some common ground. Well, they did, but it was scorched earth. Both showed up fairly sober, and for a little while, things were civil. But as the night went on and the drink started flowing, Morrison's darker side came out. He started making persistent, aggressive, and completely unwanted advances on Joplin. Known for her strength, she was having none of it. She shut him down again and again, but Morrison, deep in his cups, just wouldn't quit. Things finally boiled over when Joplin, completely fed up, decided to leave. As she was getting into a car to get away, Morrison followed her. In a shocking move, he reached into the car, grabbed a handful of her hair, and tried to pull her out. This was a massive miscalculation. Janis Joplin was not a woman you could push around. Without hesitating, she grabbed the nearest weapon she could find, a full bottle of her signature drink, Southern Comfort. She smashed the bottle right over Jim Morrison's head, knocking him out cold. It was a brutal, decisive end to his harassment. Joplin slammed the car door and sped off, leaving the so-called Lizard King sprawled on the ground. In a bizarre twist that says a lot about him, Morrison was supposedly impressed by the whole thing. According to Rothchild, Morrison later gushed, "What a great woman. She's terrific," and was genuinely crushed when Rothchild told him Janis never wanted to see him again. His admiration was a one-way street. For Joplin, this wasn't some wild rock and roll story, it was a disgusting violation. She was repulsed by his behavior, and her disdain for him was permanent, and the story might not even end there. Another tale places them at a nightclub where Jimi Hendrix was playing. Morrison, drunk again, was making a scene. Joplin, watching from the back, allegedly marched up, hit him over the head with another bottle, and then poured her drink on him. Whether it happened once or twice, the message was crystal clear. Janis Joplin had zero time for Jim Morrison's drunken antics. If one artist in the 1960s was a universally acknowledged genius, it was Jimi Hendrix. He was a true innovator, a guitarist who completely rewrote the rulebook. Jim Morrison, on the other hand, was getting a reputation for a different kind of performance, one fueled by chaos, alcohol, and a confrontational attitude that often buried the music. So when these two collided, the result wasn't a legendary jam session, it was a cringe-worthy disaster that left Hendrix with a lasting disdain for the Doors frontman. Their most infamous encounter went down in March of 1968 at a New York club called The Scene. Hendrix was on stage, leading a jam and blowing the audience's minds. Morrison, who was in the crowd and, by all accounts, wasted, decided he needed to be part of the action. He stumbled onto the stage, grabbed a mic, and proceeded to launch into a stream of guttural screams, moans, and profanity. He was so drunk he could barely stand. For an artist like Hendrix, who took music deadly seriously, this was an insult. Danny Fields, a publicist who was there, put it bluntly, it was a tasteless exhibition of scene stealing. The spectacle got even weirder when Morrison allegedly started making lewd gestures, crudely mocking Hendrix. Hendrix, ever the pro, tried to play it off, sarcastically telling the crowd, "Ladies and gentlemen, you have heard the sound of Jim Morrison." But his patience was clearly gone. The jam was ruined. That night pretty much sealed the deal. Morrison's arrogance was the polar opposite of Hendrix's focused artistry. The feeling was mutual, and it was made even clearer on another night in Montreal. Morrison, once again, tried to get on Hendrix's stage. He reportedly went up to Hendrix and said, "Hey Jimmy, let me come up and sing and we'll do this shit together." Hendrix, having learned his lesson, wasn't having it. He coolly replied, "That's okay fella, I can handle it myself." When Morrison pushed back with, "Do you know who I am?" "I'm Jim Morrison of the Doors," Hendrix delivered the final blow. "Yes, I know who you are. And I'm Jimi Hendrix." The message couldn't have been clearer. The most revered guitarist on the planet wanted nothing to do with Jim Morrison. He saw Morrison not as a shaman, but as a disruptive, unprofessional egomaniac. For Hendrix, the stage was sacred. For Morrison, it was just a playground for his own self-destruction. Not all of Jim Morrison's broken relationships started out that way. In the sun-drenched creative scene of 1960s LA, friendships were often born on the Sunset Strip. One of those early bonds was between Jim Morrison and Dennis Wilson, the charismatic drummer for the Beach Boys. At first, they were kindred spirits, two rising stars who admired each other's work. They were friends, regulars at the Whiskey A Go Go, and part of the golden age of the California sound, but this friendship wasn't built to last. As the 60s wore on, the early optimism started to sour, and so did the relationship between Morrison and Wilson. Both were struggling with fame and addiction. Wilson, usually a warm and free-spirited guy, started finding Morrison's behavior impossible to deal with. The poetic rebel he'd befriended was being replaced by a loud, belligerent drunk. The friendship really started to crack over Morrison's erratic behavior. But for Dennis Wilson, another, much darker association drove a wedge between them: Charles Manson. Before Manson became a household name for murder, he was a failed musician trying to break into the LA music scene. Wilson had infamously fallen in with Manson and his family, even letting them live in his house for a while. One disturbing story, told by Doors keyboardist Ray Manzarek, has Morrison and Wilson picking up a hitchhiking Charles Manson. While we don't know the full story of Morrison's connection to Manson, for Dennis, who was desperately trying to escape that terrifying chapter of his life, any association was toxic. Dennis began to see Jim as part of a disturbed, dangerous scene he wanted nothing to do with. The final, definitive break came right where their friendship had started, the Whiskey A Go Go. One night, Morrison, completely drunk, started loudly heckling the band on stage. For Dennis Wilson, who respected musicians, this was the last straw. It was a total betrayal of the respect they once shared. Wilson confronted Morrison, and the argument quickly turned into a physical fight. The two men who once represented the two sides of the California dream, the sun and the shadow, were now brawling in the middle of their favorite club. It was a messy, public end to their friendship. After that, the bond was completely broken. What started as a promising friendship ended in a bitter fallout, fueled by addiction, arrogance, and the darkness that would define the end of the decade. Frank Zappa was the total opposite of the 1960s rock star stereotype. He was fiercely intelligent, incredibly disciplined, and a relentless innovator. He was also staunchly anti-drug, seeing substance abuse not as a path to enlightenment, but as a dumb obstacle to real creativity. So when he looked at Jim Morrison and the myth surrounding the Doors, he was not impressed. In fact, he found the whole thing obnoxious. Zappa's problem with Morrison wasn't really personal. His wife had known Jim as a kid and said he was a nice guy. Zappa's issue was philosophical. He despised the persona, the Lizard King caricature that he believed was just cynical marketing. In one interview, Zappa laid it out. The thing that was obnoxious about Jim Morrison was when Crawdaddy magazine decided to proclaim him the Lizard King. The type of merchandising that was originally associated with Doors music I thought was really distasteful. To Zappa, Morrison was all style and no substance, an artist whose chaotic performances were wrongly labeled as profound. He believed the audience was just mistaking drug-fueled rambling for genius. He saw Morrison as a cautionary tale, a brilliant mind wasted by addiction, a creative person turned dysfunctional by the very culture that celebrated him. Zappa's critique also hit the Doors' music, which he famously called unpleasant and obnoxious. He even mocked Morrison's poetic style, once stumbling through a Morrison-esque monologue during one of his own shows to point out how silly he thought it was. Zappa was also deeply concerned about Morrison's influence on young fans. He felt that by romanticizing a reckless lifestyle, Morrison was promoting a dangerous path. Zappa's own band had a strict no-drugs policy, a world away from the chemical-fueled scene of the Doors. Zappa's public anti-smut loyalty oath was partly a reaction to Morrison's infamous arrest for indecent exposure in Miami, an act Zappa probably saw as the pathetic end of Morrison's downfall. Basically, Zappa's disdain for Morrison was a clash of worldviews. Zappa was a meticulous craftsman who believed in discipline. Morrison, in Zappa's eyes, was the poster child for hype. He didn't hate the man, he hated the phenomenon. The 60s West Coast scene was split between two hubs, the dark, whiskey-soaked world of LA, and the vibrant, communal scene of San Francisco. The Doors were kings of LA, while the Grateful Dead ruled San Francisco. So it's no surprise that Jerry Garcia, the iconic leader of the Dead, had little time for Jim Morrison. His issue wasn't about a personal fight, it was a pure, simple artistic dismissal. To Garcia, Jim Morrison wasn't just an artist he disliked, he was a fake. In a famously blunt interview, Garcia laid it all out: "I never liked the Doors. I found them terribly offensive." His biggest problem was what he saw as a total lack of originality. Garcia was convinced Morrison had just ripped off his entire stage act from Mick Jagger. "When we played with them, it was back when Jim Morrison was just a pure Mick Jagger copy," Garcia said. His moves, his whole physical appearance were totally stolen from right around Mick Jagger's 1965 tour of the States. For Garcia, who valued authenticity above all else, this kind of imitation was the ultimate artistic crime. He saw right through the mystique and saw a calculated performance, a carbon copy of someone else's charisma. He was firm, adding, "He was so patently an imitation of Mick Jagger that it was offensive." Garcia's critique didn't stop there. He was equally unimpressed with Morrison's status as a poet. As Morrison got more recognition as a literary figure, Garcia just scoffed. He thought the praise was totally unearned, especially compared to the French poets Morrison admired. "He started to earn a reputation as a poet, which I thought was really undeserved," Garcia said. "Rambo was great. Verlaine. Those guys were great. Fucking Jim Morrison was not great, I'm sorry." The Doors' music didn't do it for him either. He described their live sound as very brittle and sharp-edged, which makes sense coming from a guy whose own band was known for warm, sprawling grooves. After watching them for a couple of songs during a shared bill, Garcia simply went backstage to play his guitar, deciding, "There was nothing there that I wanted to know about." Interestingly, this was a one-sided feud. Morrison never said anything bad about the Grateful Dead. But Garcia's sharp words say a lot about the divide in 60s rock. The Dead were about community and musical exploration. The Doors were about confrontation and the singular, alienating vision of their frontman. Jerry Garcia looked at that vision and saw nothing but a pale imitation. By 1969, Led Zeppelin was on its way to becoming the biggest band in the world. They were known for tight, powerful, professional live shows. The Doors, on the other hand, were starting to fall apart under the weight of their frontman's instability. That summer, the two bands shared a bill at the Seattle Pop Festival, an event that should have been legendary. Instead, it became the night that convinced Robert Plant and Jimmy Page that Jim Morrison's act wasn't just unpredictable, it was pathetic. The members of Zeppelin, who had some respect for the Doors records, made a point to watch their set. What they saw wasn't a rock god, but a public meltdown. Morrison took the stage in a chaotic haze and, instead of connecting with the crowd, he started taunting them. He shouted, made bizarre gestures, and when someone threw a beer at him, he responded with pure venom. The set fell apart, ending with Morrison striking a crucifixion pose on stage long after his band had left. For Robert Plant, who watched with his wife, it was a deeply unsettling and disgusting experience. Plant, a frontman who commanded the stage with pure charisma, saw nothing admirable in Morrison's behavior. He hung on the side of the stage and nearly toppled into the audience, Plant later recalled. But as he got fatter and dirtier and more screwed up, they became more bizarre. So it was really sickening to watch, we couldn't believe it. Sickening is a powerful word coming from one of rock's greatest singers. Where some saw performance art, Plant just saw a mess. The professionalism that was the bedrock of Led Zeppelin was completely missing from the Doors set that night. It was a stark contrast, Zeppelin's polished power versus Morrison's sloppy implosion. Jimmy Page, while also unimpressed, was a little more nuanced. He respected the lyrics of the Doors' music, but agreed the live theatrics were way over the top. The verdict from the Zeppelin camp was clear, the Doors' live show was a train wreck. They were so unimpressed that they later felt like their job that night was to clean up the mess, delivering a powerhouse performance that completely stole the show. Some sources even suggest Morrison had his own issues with Zeppelin, supposedly saying they turned rock's mysticism into a carnival act designed to break through to the bank. Whether he said it or not, the Seattle Pop Festival drew a clear line in the sand. Led Zeppelin was the future of hard rock. Jim Morrison, in their eyes, was just a sad spectacle. Beyond the big, dramatic feuds, there was also a steady chorus of disdain for Jim Morrison from other corners of the rock world. Two of the loudest voices belonged to David Crosby and Lou Reed, two very different artists who found common ground in their total lack of respect for the Lizard King. David Crosby, a key figure in the Laurel Canyon folk rock scene, was blunt and famously opinionated. His opinion of Jim Morrison was simple: he thought he was a jerk. Crosby made no secret of his dislike, blaming Morrison's out-of-control drinking and reckless behavior. He saw Morrison as an ass who treated people badly, especially when he was drunk, which seemed to be all the time. For Crosby, whose music was about harmony, Morrison's confrontational personality was a total turn-off. Then there was Lou Reed, the godfather of punk and the mind behind the Velvet Underground. Reed was the definition of New York cool, dark, ironic, and artistically ruthless. He saw Morrison as a derivative, pretentious lightweight. Like Jerry Garcia, Reed thought Morrison was a copycat. The Velvet Underground had a stark, all-black, sunglasses-at-night aesthetic. After Morrison saw them play, he and the Doors started using a similar leather-clad look. This did not sit well with Reed or his mentor, Andy Warhol, who allegedly accused Morrison of stealing their entire act, but it went deeper than fashion. Reed just thought Morrison was shallow and that his poetic persona was a sham. When news of Jim Morrison's death reached Lou Reed, his reaction wasn't sadness. It was one single, savage, and completely dismissive remark: "How fabulous." No mourning, no respect for a fallen peer, just a sarcastic shrug for a man he saw as a cliché. For Lou Reed, Jim Morrison wasn't a tragic hero, he was a joke that had finally reached its punchline. Maybe the most damning critiques of Jim Morrison didn't come from rival bands, but from the three men who knew him best: his own bandmates. Ray Manzarek, Robbie Krieger, and John Densmore weren't just colleagues, they were the co-creators of the Doors' iconic sound. Their journey started as a brotherhood of artists, but as fame and alcoholism took over, that brotherhood started to crumble. In the early days, the chemistry was electric. They were a tight unit, pushing the boundaries of rock music together. But Morrison's escalating alcoholism drove a wedge right into the heart of the band. John Densmore, the drummer, became one of the most vocal critics of Morrison's self-destruction. In his books, he wrote about the frustration of watching his friends spiral. The concerts became a nightly gamble. Would they get the brilliant poet or the incoherent drunk? Morrison would show up late to recording sessions, if he showed up at all. He antagonized audiences, got arrested on stage, and put their entire career in jeopardy, especially after the infamous Miami incident in 1969. For Densmore, this was a betrayal of the music. The tension got so bad that the other three members seriously talked about firing Morrison. The friendship was replaced by a weary sense of babysitting. Densmore was so hurt by Morrison's disregard for his own life that he skipped his funeral and didn't visit his grave for years. Ray Manzarek, often seen as Jim's biggest supporter, also grew deeply frustrated. He publicly defended Jim's artistic spirit, but privately, he agonized over his friend's decline. He tried again and again to pull Jim back from the edge, but it was a losing battle. Robbie Krieger, the guitarist who wrote some of their biggest hits, also felt alienated. The joy of making music was gone, replaced by stress. By the end, the bond that formed the Doors had dissolved. It was just a business arrangement. The other three members loved the guy they started the band with, but they grew to resent the monster alcohol had turned him into. Their story is maybe the most tragic feud of all, not a clash of rivals, but a slow, painful civil war that destroyed their friendship and led to the early end of one of rock's most brilliant frontmen. Jim Morrison's legacy is a true paradox. He's still this powerful icon of rebellion whose posters hang on countless walls. His voice, his poetry, and his music still captivate new generations. He was, and is, a legend, but the stories told by his peers paint a much more complicated picture. To Janis Joplin, he was a violent creep. To Jimi Hendrix, he